Kia ora, na koutou katoa, ko Ruth Copeland tōku ingoa, no whakatū oku tipuna. Good afternoon and welcome to another Mutu Public Policy Seminar. These events are one way that we have of achieving our mission to enable some really good discussion around these really important policy areas. We'd like to thank our supporters at this point for helping us to do this. They are the Productivity Commission, Statistics New Zealand, ECA, and of course the Treasury. So you'll be well aware in New Zealand that we've been using the Treasury's Living Standards framework for over 10 years now. And our version has been closely aligned with international models like those of the OECD. He Ara Waiora is a mātauranga Māori framing of wellbeing that the Treasury now uses alongside the Living Standards framework. So in this seminar today, we'll be discussing He Ara Waiora and also some new changes to the Living Standards framework that make it work better alongside He Ara Waiora. So in today's discussion, Phil Evans and Tim Hughes, both from Treasury, will be leading. Phil is a principal advisor supporting the implementation of He Ara Waiora, and Tim has been leading the work to refresh the Living Standards framework. We've also got a panel of 3 today joining us. We have Atawhai Tibble, who is a Māori wellbeing and data expert. Atawhai had the leading role in Te Kupenga, which is the world's first Indigenous wellbeing survey. Tracy McIntosh is the Chief Science Advisor at MSD and also Professor of Indigenous Studies at Te Wānanga o Waipapa at the University of Auckland. And Arthur Grimes is a Senior Fellow here at Mutu Research, and he's the Chair of Wellbeing and Public Policy at Victoria University of Government. So after the presentation today, we will ask each of the panel members to speak briefly to the presentation, and then what we'll do is we'll open it up to audience questions. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. You'll be able to raise your hand down below, and you can also type those questions into the Q&A, and we'll just sort of go through those one by one and ask whoever in the panel would like to answer the question to go for it. So once again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us here today. And we'll ask Phil to share a screen and let's get on with the presentation.
He Māori ora, ko te tai whakaronga, ko te tai whakararo, ko te tai tōkerau, ko te tai tonga, ko te tai hauauru, ko te tai rāwhiti, tēnei ko te tai ohanga, tuturu whakamaua kia tīna, hui e, tai ki e. Tēnā rā tātou, tuatahi kei te mihi kia koe Ruth, me te whānau o motu, nā koutou rā tō tātanei hui whakahaere. Ko tira ka mihi au ki tō tātanei paiwhiri, e te rangatira e Atawhai, e te mātauranga ohanga e Arthur, te wahine toa e Tracy, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Ka mihi whānui ki a tātou e whakarongo mai nei, tēnā tātou, tēnā tātou, tēnā rā tātou. Kia mōhio mai koutou ko wai au, ko Taranaki te maunga, ko Urunui te awa, ko Ngāti Mutunga te iwi. Ka huri whakate toka, ko Kaitahu te iwi, ko Araki te mauka, ko Phil Evans tōku ingoa. Kia ora tātou. As Tracy explained, I'm a Principal Policy Advisor working here in the Treasury, supporting the implementation of He Ara Waiora. It's a real pleasure to talk to you about this. I understand we've got quite a big audience watching today, and Tim and I were just talking before we came on that us policy nerds actually like to stay in the background. So yeah, big experience for us, and great to have you all interested in this kaupapa. I thought I'd just start off by talking a little bit about these words, He Ara Waiora. Ara is a pathway. away into the future. Waiora is kind of an equivalent concept to well-being. Wai being water, the source of life, and ora being life. And he is the indefinite article. So this is a pathway to well-being, not the pathway to well-being. And I just thought I'd explain that initially, given that words are important. So as Tracy mentioned, this framework is built on Te Ao Māori knowledge and perspectives. In fact, if we take a little bit of a look into its whakapapa, it originated with the tax working group in 2017. I'm sure we all remember that piece of mahi led by Sir Michael Cullen and the panel that worked on that, and it mused about various things, including capital gains tax. But one of the questions they asked themselves was, what would a Te Ao Māori perspective or a tikanga perspective actually have to tell us about the tax system in New Zealand? And to that end, they pulled together a group of experts, and they're called Ngā Pukenga, who developed the initial framework for He Ara Waiora. Not all of the tax working group's recommendations got taken up by the government, obviously, but one thing the government remained keen on was the use of He Ara Waiora, and so asked the Treasury to continue to work with Te Ao Māori experts and thought leaders to keep stewarding this framework, and we continue to do that. I think it's also worth reflecting that the living standards, which is kind of the older of the two frameworks, when it initially came along, held some resonance for Te Ao Māori, in that it was moving away from a kind of singular focus on the bottom line and into multiple bottom lines. And what He Ara Waiora attempts to do is to take that one step further and really talk about some of the integrated value of these things. And if you are interested, you can look at Sasha McMeeking's work on hybrid organisations. That's organisations with more than one kind of basic driver, whether it be a financial and a social kind of bent, which a lot of iwi organisations have, and some of the conflicts that can occur there, and the fact that many Māori organisations now seek and act like more with the integrated value lens. That's a very interesting piece of work. So with that, I think I'll move on to explaining the framework in a little bit of detail about what's in it, some of the concepts that are encapsulated in there, and then just talk a little bit about some of the ways we're starting to apply it. And this is a kind of evolutionary approach rather than one big bang, and I'll talk about some of the reasons for that as well. So we start here. This circle diagram is in essence the framework, which is made up of two parts, ends and means. So the ends kind of encapsulate the substantive domains of well-being from a Te Ao Māori point of view, and it's kind of like the what's important here. And roughly speaking, those are the middle three circles you can see there, Wairua, Te Taiao, and Te Ira Tangata. The ends are, in a policy application sense, less well understood than the means, and I'll return to that point in a moment. If we start at the centre of the diagram, we're looking at the concept of Wairua, which is spirituality or spirit. It's very striking immediately that unlike some other government frameworks, this is not people-centred, not child-centred, not whānau-centred or anything like that, centred on Wairua as the foundation or source of well-being. This could potentially lead to some confusion or angst if you seek to automatically equate that with religion. For some people, I'm sure it does encapsulate that idea, but it's also broader than that. And we have to remember some of the undertakings that were made at the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi about religious freedom, including the ongoing importance of Māori traditional concepts. I'm not necessarily the best person to talk in depth about Wairua, and it is a very deep subject. for many Māori people, and encapsulate the idea of te ao atua and that kind of realm. But I think even the most secular of us can understand this somewhat as being about the essence of well-being and about that kind of essential feel. I sometimes explain this to my colleagues here by recounting a story told by a certain well-known Tūhoe rugby coach who was on a trip with a Māori team in Scotland. Coming to the last game, he said he looked around the bus at his team and he said he could smell defeat. There was nothing obvious, but it was just that kind of essence or feel around the team bus as he looked around. And so he brought his senior players together and said, you have to address this. And then the staff at the hotel, when they arrived, were treated to the sight of these large Māori guys taking mattresses down to the basement to set up a wānanga and talk about it marae style. So it's about that kind of essence of well-being and fundamentally our ability to do things well together. It's also important to note, before I go too much further, that spiral pattern you can see throughout the diagram is takarangi, and that indicates that all these concepts are kind of interlinked. So that's another key way in which we understand Waiora. For a secular organisation like Treasury, how do we apply this? Well, that's something where we're not at yet. We have to work closely with Māori thought leaders and advisors who are expert, and obviously we have to balance a number of things in doing so. So if we step out from Waiora towards away from the centre, we're still not into the human realm, we're into te taiao, or the natural world. Now the idea here is that te taiao is intrinsically important, and that it's important to look after te taiao in order for human beings to thrive. And obviously with COP26 and so on going on at the moment, this is more important than ever and more at top of mind than ever for a lot of people. There is a spiritual connection to it as well, and many people in New Zealand will experience this if they go out into te taiao. And there's a lot of obviously Indigenous knowledge connected with the tiakitanga, the care of te taiao. All humans impact on the environment to some extent. Over the centuries, Māori developed systems around rāhui and other means of taking care of te taiao. And so that's close to the centre than human well-being, because human well-being is dependent on the life systems that support us. So now we can step out into the next ring, the red one, and we are into the human realm, te ira tangata. There are two elements to this, tangata, which you might think of, if you like, as the individual, and kāinga, which can mean a home or a village, which we might think of as the collective. The key concept in this realm is mana. There are four elements of mana here that our experts have unpacked for us. So mana tuku iho is about the mana that's handed down. It's about connections, identity, cultural strength. Mana taututu is about connections and reciprocity, and the mana that comes from that, from participating in a community and fulfilling your obligations in that community as well. And we can see this at play perhaps in the negative at the moment. There's some commentary about uptakes of COVID-19 vaccines and there being a deficit of trust between state and people. Mana āheinga. Āheinga is capability. And so this picks up, I guess, on the idea that's encapsulated in final order to some extent. The idea that people will thrive if they're able to kind of set their own aspirations and have the capability to achieve them. And mana whanake is about sustainable growth, whanake being the word to grow. And sustainable is important because this framework in a Te Ao Māori perspective crosses generations. And not only do you look back to your tūpuna, but many Māori organisations work with this view several generations ahead in the kind of well-being that they're seeking to create. So many Māori organisations, be it small SMEs or land-based incorporations or iwi, are trying to work along these lines. They might not always use exactly the same words, but this will be kind of familiar territory. So that's the ends. That's what our experts have told us is important in wellbeing. And so now I can move to the means. So these may be some slightly more familiar concepts broadly within Aotearoa New Zealand. A lot of these things are quite well known. He Ara Waiora, unlike the Living Standards Framework, prescribes these as kind of behaviours, the sorts of behaviours that are required in order to realise those aspirations for wellbeing. So the first one, kotahitanga, is about kind of unity, alliances, working in coordination. I always find a cheesy rugby analogy works quite here as well. In fact, rugby analogies always work well when talking with overseas colleagues from Wales or Ireland. I find they work less well with the Nordics, who just look a bit puzzled. But kotahitanga, you can think of it like a scrum. You have 8 people in a scrum. They all come from different backgrounds, urban, rural, Māori, Pacific, Pākehā, whatever. They may not agree on everything, but for that purpose, they all push together in the same direction. Otherwise, the whole thing falls over. That's basically the idea of kotahitanga. We can think of it if we're applying it in a government sense. And again, I add the caution that we have to be very careful that we don't co-opt these terms and just kind of slap them on to whatever it is we want to do as government, and that we strive to apply them authentically. But if we look at this in a government sense, we're probably familiar with the issue of silos across government and the need to kind of correct those, and the need to work closely with communities as well in forming policy. Tikanga, again, this is in itself a very kind of steeped concept. Tikanga, it's kind of the system of norms around what is right, or tika. For government, that includes a lot of things, including the way we work with iwi, Māori, and other communities in Aotearoa. People ask, where is the Treaty of Waitangi in this framework? I'd like to say it's throughout, but if you want to sit it somewhere in particular, it's obviously tika to uphold the agreements and promises that you've made. And this involves close partnership with the treaty partner as well, quite obviously. And this leads us into the next one, whanaungatanga, which is about strong relationships and networks. The root of that word is whānau. And so I think that's almost quite self-explanatory. Manaakitanga is another word that many New Zealanders will be familiar with, often kind of translated as hospitality or something like that. It has a lot of depth to it as well. We can think of it as a focus on improved wellbeing and enhanced mana. The word mana is in there as an aki, or encourage. And we can think about the ethic of care that we have towards each other. And for government agencies, this is particularly important when you're trying to serve a community. Distributional analysis can be very important to identify and address inequities. And it's also very important to understand what those communities are actually seeking, rather than have Wellington kind of impose solutions that we might have dreamed up in the small room that we're sitting in here. Tiakitanga is not on the diagram, it has an asterisk to it because it's going to be promoted. It's about caring for the systems that support wellbeing, tiaki, to look after, including the environment. So we talked about te taiao a bit earlier. Again, if we relate this to the work of the Treasury, then obviously there's a whole lot of systems that we take care of that help the government run. And that's, I guess, one of the reasons for the Treasury wanting to uptake these wellbeing frameworks in order to support us in doing that. So I think that's a good point now flip over into thinking about some of the live examples that we have going. A couple of kia tūpato or cautions first. One is that we're very clear that we don't own any aspect of this mātauranga Māori and that we seek to apply it in a credible way. The approach that we're taking to this is to pilot and evaluate. So we're taking it on in small steps because many of these concepts, government agencies just don't have the capability at present to pick them up and run with them. So it's a matter of piloting, learning, and taking advice and correction from Māori thought leaders that we continue to work alongside with as He Ara or fellow travellers. We've sought there to avoid the language of kind of advisory and some of that more patronising kind of stuff. And we've thought of it as being on a journey together. So here are some of the things that we're working on. We did, as the Treasury, apply He Ara Waiora through Budget 21 in a very kind of low-key way. We looked at the initiatives that came in and kind of took an indicative approach to consider the alignment of those initiatives with the principles. Those are the means that I talked about. So if I just jump back quickly, kotahitanga, tikanga, and so on. And we did learn some interesting things from that. We saw some initiatives that showed strong kotahitanga, for example, where agencies had lined up iwi relationships, other agencies, local government, and so on, and obviously some not so good ones. And we're seeking to extend that in Budget 22 alongside the Living Standards Framework. And again, while being genuine with these concepts, we've tried to look for practical ways of breaking this down. So we encourage agencies to, and supporting agencies to think about He Ara Waiora in terms of the initiatives they're putting forward. For example, manaakitanga. We might encourage them to think about understanding the perspectives of the affected groups in the communities, whether that be iwi Māori or others, and the impact that any initiative is likely to have on them. Tikanga, again, we can ask about whether certain initiatives are being designed and implemented in partnership with those who will be affected, which is a stronger approach than having kind of Wellington-centric solutions. And again, COVID is showing us that sometimes just trusting community organisations to do things can be the best approach. And so a TICO approach might be considering some of that as well. We do have some other key products in the Treasury. One coming up, which is the Wellbeing report. The Public Finance Act requires us to produce a report, first one next year, looking at wellbeing, indicators of wellbeing in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and how these be sustained into the future. Te Tirohanga Mokopuna is already published, and you can find that. That's our long-term fiscal statement, which has used He Ara Waiora and some of its framing. We're working with the other relevant agencies to develop some quant around this as well, indicators and measures. Again, that's at a very early stage. And there are a variety of other agencies that are trying to implement He Ara Waiora as well with our support. And one of those is the Productivity Commission. And you can go onto their website and have a look at how they're thinking about it in terms of their fair chance for all. So that's really the end of my presentation on He Ara Waiora. I'd be very interested to hear what questions will come up and what the panelists have to say on that. As I say, very careful with the use of some of these concepts, but again, have to balance that with starting to bring it into the real world, and be really interesting to hear what Atawhai and Tracy have to say about that when the time comes. But for now, I'll hand over to Tim, who's going to talk to us about the Living Standards Framework and the refresh that's occurred in 2021. Nā reira, tēnā rā tātou.
I'll just leave it on. Kia ora Phil, kia ora koutou. I've only got a few minutes, so I won't say much on the LSF. This is just really to let you know that there is a new LSF that's been released. It was released on Thursday last week, so you can check that out online on the Treasury website. There's a lot of material there. It's also a talk next week we're doing under Jen, so if you want to learn more about the new LSF, come along to that. But just what I did want to say was just to remind you, I guess, what the LSF is, which is really, it's come out of a need to provide internal guidance within the Treasury to our own staff about what we mean by our corporate vision statement, which is lifting living standards for all New Zealanders. So it's primarily a by Treasury for Treasury tool. It is used by others, particularly this government, which is partly why we participate in events like this, but it's first and foremost an internal guidance for Treasury staff. And you can see it being used in every aspect of our work. So it is used in budget, but it's not just a budget thing. We do have indicators and a dashboard, but it's not just a measurement thing. It's primarily a learning and a thinking tool to help all people in Treasury understand the basics of wellbeing and living standards analysis. So this is the living standards framework you're probably familiar with. This is the one we issued in 2018. Very similar to the OECD How's Life framework. So that has some real strengths in that it's very much grounded in that enormous international evidence base, and it's also provides good points for international comparison. But we've decided to change it in 2021 because I guess some of those strengths are also weaknesses. So we had feedback at the time suggesting it was too generic and international. It could be any country's living standards framework. It was also because the international models are quite focused on adults' wellbeing, light on children's wellbeing, which is particularly important for us. It was also light in terms of its treatment of culture. Perhaps the only difference with the OECD How's Life framework was that cultural identity domain, which we had feedback suggesting was too light. Culture is more important, people said to us. And people also said, I guess, in light with that fact that it was too generic, that it was insufficiently attuned to wellbeing as understood in this country, particularly by Māori and by Pacific peoples. So I won't go into a lot of detail. Just emphasise that both frameworks are being iteratively developed. So He Ara Waiora is a pathway to wellbeing. The LSF is a pathway as well, and they're also not fixed. You know, we relay those paths as we go. So this won't be the final word. But as for a teaser, this is the teaser. This is the new living standards framework. You'll first look at it probably. I won't describe all of the changes in detail. There's a lot of substance that we've thought through, but some of the big ones that you notice are, one, we've added culture as underpinning all aspects of our wealth and is something that needs to be sustained and protected into the future alongside the other aspects of our wealth. We've moved away from some of that language of capitals to emphasise that things like the natural environment can be valued as more than just factors in production. It's not just the source of goods and services, ecosystem services for consumption. Many people view the importance of nature as being bigger than that. We've changed some of the wellbeing domains, particularly to reflect children's wellbeing. So, for example, we've changed time used for leisure and play, and we've changed social connections to family and friends. We've changed cultural identity to cultural capability and belonging. And the biggest change, perhaps, is adding institutions in the middle of the framework. So that is to, I guess, really get at the heart of the framework, which is designed to be used for policy, which requires us to understand and inquire into the processes and the options that are available for different actors in society for both building and lifting living standards and wellbeing, and also sustaining our wealth into the future. And it also helps address one of the criticisms that the LSF was paternalistic or overstating the role of government in producing wellbeing, which is something that many actors in society have an important role in, including the institutions of tangata whenua, which we've added in there as one of the 6 institutional spheres. So that's all I'm going to say for now, though, as I say, if you want to come along to the talk next week, I encourage you to do so. And if there are any questions as part of the next part of this webinar, happy to answer them as well. Kia ora.
Thank you so much for that, kia ora. So I'd just like to ask each panelist in turn if they would, be happy to give some feedback on that presentation and just a different slant on the information presented here today.
Kia ora. I'm not so sure if this is in alphabetical order, but I might defy. And Arthur would have gone first, I think. But anyway, if it's first name. Tuatahi, can I just acknowledge mana whenua taranaki nui tonu, koutou, kurama, e manaki nei a tātou. Secondly, could I also acknowledge the Tax Working Party, rātou kua mene ki te pō, me nā mātanga. I want to acknowledge Sir Michael Cullen, but also Maruku Henare, who passed away, and their amazing work with Sasha and others, not just with the whole tax working group, kaupapa, but also He Ara Waiora. Just really briefly, because we've only got about 5 minutes each. Just two things. I think some ideas that come to my head are revolution and evolution. When I worked in Treasury and we were, I think, working on Ben Gleisner's work, the original living standard stuff, I don't think that I could imagine that we would have gone this far. So could I acknowledge you, Tim, and the team, and also you, Phil, your mahi, because as a person who, Te Ao Māori and Māori thoughts and ideas are really important, it's just good to see a couple of things, a bit of humility. So the fact that we're trying to iterate and not pretend we know everything. Obviously, there are things that we do know, but there are also plenty of things we don't know. So I think that's really, really important. And I think the fact that Treasury is willing to learn and listen. I like those concepts and notions of not just having Māori as advisory, which we're sick of that word, but hoa haere, or people coming alongside the Treasury on the journey, or maybe it's the other way around. So I just want to acknowledge that. When it comes to well-being, I mean, the challenge with that word is it means many things to many people. And sometimes when we talk about it, we probably need a prefix. So is it environmental well-being? Is it kind of material well-being? Is it social well-being? Is it cultural? And when you have those prefixes, those things kind of give sense. What I like about He Ara Waiora and even the LSF, it's trying to bring those things together, which I think Arthur and Tracy will talk about. That's a mammoth task. But I just want to acknowledge the Treasury for having a crack at this, because you could have easily ignored what Māori and others and New Zealanders have said for a long time, that those traditional frameworks are important and tell us something. They do not tell us everything we need to know about what matters to us. So on the cultural stuff, again, I just want to acknowledge Phil, the team your work is doing in there, Sasha and your group that you're working with of experts. I think across the public service, we are all trying to work out how to bring Māori concepts and ideas to the table. And I want to acknowledge the work being done in the Mental Health and Wellbeing Commission, who have He Ara Oranga, similar but different. And there are multiple models across Te Ao Māori and across the public service. And I think what this represents is the multiplicity of Māori views and different views in terms of what's important. But could I just say, I'm at risk of being too effusive in my praise. There are obviously things that we need to work out, and ties we've got to kick, and kaupapa we need to kind of sit down together and work through. I think the wairua being central is really, really special and important. But again, what that means, I think there are conversations we still need to have about that. But I just want to acknowledge this mahi, because I saw it in the early stages, and this is way more than that. Nā reira tēnei o mihina kia koutou, aku rangatira kai taku pāpā, Trevor, o tira koutou. Kara, e para nei tēnei huripara. Tēnei kaupapa tēnei o mihinei. I want to acknowledge Arthur and Tracy, who are speaking as well after me. Tēnā koutou, thank you for having me. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora atawhai. Arthur, would you like to keep us going with the A's?
Kia ora tātou, thank you, Ruth. Atawhai and Tracy, hi, and Tim and Phil, thanks very much for that fascinating presentation. I want to start off with the LSF and then just move briefly onto He Ara Waiora. I find the evolution of the LSF very, very interesting. I was pushing for a much stronger emphasis on culture in the previous LSF, so it's great to see that underpinning role for culture in this version. I'm also absolutely delighted to see the emphasis on children. I think that's been really missing from most wellbeing frameworks around the world. And I think that's a huge improvement in this version of the LSF. I also like the emphasis on institutions and governance, which I think is critical in thinking about how we can improve well-being, and it's also got some cultural, multicultural aspects to it. The diagram is increased in complexity compared with where we were before, and one of my queries or quandaries about the previous version of the LSF is how would it actually be used, given that there wasn't really a framework there. It was really a more of a picture of lots of different things that can affect living standards and well-being, and it didn't actually have a particular framework for how they connected together. And I think this one is perhaps even more subject to that critique. There's lots of aspects to the living standards framework, but it's not clear that it's a framework as such. It's not clear how one actually sees how these different pieces are connected to each other. So I think it's very much a work in progress to see how all these disparate parts of the LSF actually work as a coherent framework in a particular area of policy analysis or cross-policy analysis. But there's been real gains, I think, in the process. And can I just give a shout out to Tim, his background paper, which you can obtain from Treasury's website. It's discussion paper 2101, and it's a fabulous background paper, very, very thoughtful background paper that goes behind this new version of the LSF. If I can move on to He Ara Waiora, this was really very interesting. I've been working on some issues with Māori collaborators recently on issues of Māori cultural well-being and other aspects of health as well. And one of the things that comes through there, and it builds on something that Atawhai said, is that there are a number of other frameworks that are around dealing with Māori well-being. And more recently we've had Te Whānau Rangatira framework from Superu, which was a very innovative framework, I thought. We've also had the work that Te Kupenga grew out of from Stats New Zealand, which Fiona Cram and others have written about. And what I don't understand really is why Treasury reinvented the wheel rather than building on the extant frameworks that were already there and already being used in multiple government agencies. But now there's a new one to build to replace them or whatever. I'm not quite sure of the rationale for that. And of course, all of these pretty much build on Te Wharatapawha from Mason Jury, and you go back to his 1985 article in Social Science and Medicine. And one of the things that really fascinated me about that is that one of the aspects of that is it's very like He Ara Waiora. It emphasizes He Ara Waiora as being central to the various aspects of Māori wellbeing. So he is 4Po. That's the most important one, underpinning one, in terms of spiritual component. But one of the things he really emphasizes when he discusses this, and remember this came out of not hui with experts, this is with hui on the marae, all around the country. And he says, without access to traditional or tribal land, many Māori elders would diagnose poor health. And if you look back at his 1985 article, land is at the center of that article, along with Wairoa. And I don't see as much emphasis on that in He Ara Waiora, or the way that it's been emphasized within the Living Standards Framework document that's come out. And I wonder whether that's because Treasury is somewhat in a difficult situation, that if access and actually probably ownership of the land is central to Māori spirituality and Māori health in general, can Treasury actually go the full hog and say, actually, what we need is a much greater either partnership or actually back to Māori ownership of land, which is the centerpiece of Māori spirituality. So I wonder whether He Ara Waiora is actually just not getting to the heart of the matter by not emphasizing the role of land. So I'll leave that as a question mark for you. But thank you very much. I found both documents, both the new Living Standards Framework, plus the work on He Ara Waiora, really fascinating. Thanks.
Kia ora, Arthur. Maybe that's something, Phil, you'd like to speak to, the issue around the land.
Should we have Tracy first, Ruth?
Yes, okay. We'll just save that for later, Tracy, please.
Moriori kia koutou, ngā mihi kia koutou. Ki ngā mana whenua, tēnā koutou katoa, tēnā kōrua. Phil, me, Tim, tēnā kōrua. Ko waio, ko matatua te waka, ko te tahuhu o hao ki taha te maunga, ko tamarau ki te kōrero te tangata, ko tunuku te whenua, ko tunuku te papakainga, ko tunuku te marae, ko Ngāti Kaura, Kirikawa ki te rākau te hapu, ko tūhoi te iwi, ko Tracy McIntosh tēnei. So really wonderful to be here. I really want to recognise and acknowledge, as both Atawhai and Arthur have, an incredible level of work that's been done prior to this. You know, when I was listening to the presentation, I was very aware of a range of voices there, both tipuna voices, but also voices that are still very present with us, and sort of thinking about particularly some of that constitutional transformation work, the work that was done with Matiki Mai, particularly as expressed by Moana Jackson, in terms of what's that underlying value. And I think it speaks to what you're just talking about there, Arthur, the need to ensure the well-being of Papatūānuku. And so I think that is something that is really central there. For us to be well, our waters and our land must also be well. So I want to commend, you know, in terms of the presentations, really want to commend, you know, Atawhai speaks about it. Could we imagine that we would see this 10 years ago, 20 years ago, coming out of Treasury? So I do want to recognise how it draws on the work of many people from before, really recognising that work, but also recognising that, you know, that the knowledge generation is continuing. I think one thing for me that, you know, in terms of the discussion around partnership, I think it's useful to have a discussion around not sitting within a co-design space, but what it means when we're in a co-determination space, when we're thinking about the ways that we want to determine our futures. So tēnā rangatiratanga sits within that, but it's around that co-determination. One of the things, if we're going to draw on mātauranga Māori, you cannot have mātauranga Māori without Māori. And so the leadership issue, I think, is also something that we need to be clearly addressing. So I understand the partnership, I applaud it, but I really want to see what it means in terms of the shifts about what the Māori leadership means, both sitting in whānau, sitting in communities, but also sitting in places like Treasury and across a lot of those other spaces. So, you know, I do get excited when I look at the different frameworks, and then that excitement is usually always tempered by what does it mean for the child today in Clendon? What does it mean for the child today in Porirua? What does it mean for that child? How will they know that this framework will infect their lives? What will be the indicators for them of those changes? And so I think that there we need to sort of really think about, when we look at these frameworks, how is power expressed and understood within these frameworks? How do we understand both powerlessness and the exercising of power sitting within those spaces? I think they're a really important element, particularly when we see the tangas being pulled up as they are. How do we give true expression to it? And I really, again, applaud that element around wanting to have authentic expression of these issues and recognizing that that's difficult, recognizing that it's hard. Arthur sort of already talked about that. In many ways, our cup runs over. We're awash with frameworks. I know that I sit, with Te Pai Tata, for example, within MSD, that the frameworks themselves, I think, are the pono, they're right, the way they should be. How do you give expression to it? Mm-hmm. And so those are the elements, I guess, that, for all of us collectively, for us to think about. Very much enjoyed, but I see the effort and the work that you put in, both Phil and Tim, and recognize all of the, the work that's been done by so many people around. And I also want to recognize that within Treasury, my understanding is that Phil and Tim come from relatively small teams. And I often wonder, what does that mean? What does it mean in terms of the living standard framework? What does it mean in terms of He Ara Waiora? What does it mean when we sit in small teams doing such significant and important work? And so I'll finish with that. I can see that there's been some really wonderful comments already coming up. So I'm sure that we will have a rich discussion. Mauri ora kia koutou.
Kia ora, Tracy. Thank you for that. Yeah, I can see as well here within the questions coming through, there is a real interest in the application of these frameworks and how that will be rolled out, and particular interest around issues of sustainability, in particular our biophysical systems. Kath speaks about we have to find a way of resetting expectations so that well-being grows, not our pressures and uses of resources and stresses on natural systems. And how do we convey this in fast? I'm just wondering if Phil or Tim, if you'd like to speak to how this framework interfaces specifically to our biodiversity losses.
Kia ora tata. This might be a good place to address the land comment as well. This mihi to our panelists and some of the comments made. I think it's right. I think even 20 years ago, 10 years ago, we may not have been able to have these conversations so freely and openly. So I think that's really great. The place of whenua, obviously, Arthur, you're completely right about the central place of whenua, and there are many whakatauki that support that notion. I see it as being a part of te taiao, along with biodiversity, water, and all those other, all those other aspects. You can also see it in mana tuku iho, which is part of the framework. The mana that's handed down from our tupuna and will be handed down to future generations. And in tiakitanga as well, the duty to care for what we have around us and the systems that support us. Biodiversity, I agree with the tenor of Kath's comment around the urgency of these issues. He Ara Waiora, by having te taiao closer to the centre and kind of closer to the centre than the human realm, does elevate the importance of these issues as well. The nub of it, as several people in the comments and the panelists have mentioned is taking this intention and turning it into action. And we are in the early stages of that. And because of, again, I can see some of the comments and questions about how does the Treasury really seek to understand some of these ideas that are in He Ara Waiora. And it's about just beginning to apply them with the right kind of support and co-determination with Māori as well. It's one of those things where we have to work fast, but we're in a place where we also have to move carefully to make sure we don't misstep, if that makes any sense. And I'd like to also, while I'm talking, clarify one other comment that's made in the Q&A or somewhere. I don't actually like rugby. I just find it useful as a kind of analogy. Tim, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I'll just unmute myself there. I'll just stop sharing the screen too.
Mike's not on.
Yes, I think you're muted still.
The first purpose.
Whoops.
Apologies. Just muted my colleague there.
Oops.
So, yeah, just to pick up on a couple of the lines of questioning there, particularly around applications. So in my comments, I indicated that these frameworks, the first purpose of them really is inward looking, backwards towards ourselves. So that might seem indulgent to some extent, but I think it's really important actually when it comes to that question of how we imagine the public that we serve, because we do live in Wellington, and Wellington's a special place in more than one way. And one of the challenges of living here is the difficulty of staying connected to the reality of people's lives across the country. So my first job actually out of uni was as a social work assistant, and a big part of that profession is professional supervision, and the same goes for all sorts of different professions. So it's always struck me that in policy we call ourselves professionals, but we don't actually have any formal mechanism for professional supervision or spaces for reflexivity. And one of the really important areas of reflexivity is on that topic of how we're imagining the public. So it may, as I say, seem indulgent, but I think it's really important to have frameworks and conversations like this are happening within the public service, so that we can constantly be checking in with each other on where we're at. And some of the most interesting conversations within Treasury have arisen primarily because we now have two frameworks. So that makes some people really uncomfortable. They're used to using just one framework. We're saying, how on earth can I, use these two completely different ways of thinking, particularly when we tell people that we think there might be something of value in He Ara Waiora for the well-being of the entire population, not just for tangata whenua. And one of the big questions that does come up when people engage with that was, well, what is my relationship like with the land? And what does it mean for me to be here in this particular place and to find my well-being in this physical environment and in this particular social context? And that leads to quite a fruitful discussion. But I agree, those conversations themselves aren't particularly useful to children in Clendon. So one of the things I like to say internally is that we need to be careful about how much expectation we place on a framework. A framework, at the end of the day, is just a framework. Visually, I think of like a building structure, an incomplete building with a steel framing or the timber framing is there. So a framework is not watertight. It has a lot of holes in it, but it can be created into something substantial with further work. So the application of these frameworks and the value in these frameworks comes through the particular context in which they're used. And although our teams are small, the work of our colleagues is very large, and it might not always be visible outside of the building or outside of the public service, but it's that process of thinking through these concepts and trying to figure out how to bring life to them in regular bits of policy to ministers, our big flagship reports like the Wellbeing report and the long-term fiscal statement, big events like the budget, where hopefully that that reflective work that we've done as professionals hopefully bears fruit and hopefully makes a difference for people out there. Though it's a long causal chain and it's difficult to see the attribution all the way through there, but that's what we're trying to do, at least with this mahi.
Hey, could I say something just about, I forgot to mihi you, Tim, for your magnum opus, that big document you made. I've been to a presentation where you've tried to give a summary. It was amazing. So me mihi o kia koe. And I just want to acknowledge the point that you raised, Tracy, about, tell Māori we're not looking for co-design, we're looking for co-determination. That's an amazing statement. It's so true. And I think just something about application. The thing that I think Treasury have done here is they've put some po in the ground. Arguably, people could say, oh, well, those po have been there for a while. And I do agree with Tracy's comment that, all of these things, I'm not a big person for talking about standing on the shoulders of giants. I think we sit at the feet of our pakeke. So there's been a lot of people whose feet we're sitting at who have left behind treasures for us. And these things are here today and they've manifested in the po of the Living Standards Framework. From a public policy sense, I just know lots of people are looking to it and thinking, actually, we've always wanted to do something with wairuatanga or kaitiakitanga. And now because the Treasury says something, it's really important. So I think the symbolism and the importance of Treasury saying things, whether we like it or not, that's a critical thing. It's been really positive. And I think more from the opportunity space, that it's not so much about Treasury giving guidelines about this is how you do it. I think it's opened up opportunities. I see them as opportunities. I got contacted by a cousin of mine who's doing some work with a council on some water stuff. And they said, oh, Atawhai, they said we have to do it like the He Ara Waiora. So how do we do that? And rather than saying, well, we need more guidance, I saw that particular rōpū of my whānau using the opportunity to educate the local council people in tikanga, wairua, kaitiakitanga, and all these things. So I think a practical example of how there being less guidance, I might be being naughty here, Phil and Tim, but I think it's a good thing because this is iterative and we'll learn as we go along. So that's all. Kia ora, tēnā koutou.
Kia ora, I might just follow up on some of the things that Atawhai has put in there, and also just responding to what's in the chat and the questions around applications around wairuatanga, how that can be really, what that actually means, particularly within secular spaces. But I think the wairuatanga really gives us the space to, one, enhance our broad cultural identities. So I think that there's how you think about that, thinking about what are our traditions and practices in place in space, but also really around the issues around restoration, the restoration of mana and of healing. That those elements, I think, sit really strongly in the wairuatanga space, that these are evolving, they're ongoing. When we look at the Living Standard Framework, we have to be, we're cognizant that there have been that the trajectories of wellness have been so disrupted for sectors of our society that we recognize the ongoing intergenerational transfer of social inequalities, what that means for Māori and what that means for others as well. That wairuatanga really gives us a space to be able to sit with that, to sit with the mamai, but not to be so burdened by it that we can no longer do anything about it. So that it's sitting within that space. It's a space of restoration. I think it can be a space of healing, but it's a space of critical reflection for a different trajectory. That's the mokapunatanga. That's the element of going forward. That can sit in the wairuatanga space. So it gives us a place to actually just to reveal the harms that have been done, but also, as I said, not to be incapacitated by them, but to be emboldened to create those spaces for change. So I do see it in a really practical way in terms of applications within institutional settings, in terms of what the kawa of a place is, what your practices are, what you determine as tika in those places. So I think that's a really good place, that works with wairuatanga in that way. but it's this other place that if we are to have a living standings framework, if we are to create a New Zealand that really works around its social inequities, where the well-being in terms of our ability to flourish as Māori, but also as whoever we are, then I think Wairuatanga gives us a place to actually do that work of radical honesty, but create a place of going forward.
Who would like to pick up after Tracy?
Hey, we're on a bit of a roll here, mate. So I just want to address Arthur's point about land. So it's funny, when we created Te Kupenga, Arthur, we did a lot of work with the Massey team that, you know, obviously we're under the tutelage of Sir Professor Mason Jury. We're part of the Te Huinukurua longitudinal research. And in their land was one of the key things that the elders said, this was really, really central. And then what they came across, they realized was the disenfranchised. They were disenfranchised. They were no longer the owners of their own land. And so you see this big gap, you know, in terms of the aspiration, whenua, and all these tikanga that we know are central, a bit like te reo Māori. But the reality is, in terms of people being separated from those things, that was not their day-to-day reality. So I know that when we did TK or Te Kupenga, we focused a lot on, you know, sense of tūranga waiwai, marae, so that kind of land space that they may know, that they connect to, and we see that that rates highly. So, but however, when it came to the practical, do you know your land blocks? How connected are you to those? Well, but we all know the story of Māori land, and it's not a good story. So I think it's that kind of that colonial disruption. So the theory is, and I think these are the things we hold on to, is the aspiration is X, but then the reality is that's been disrupted. And so I think part of all this journey is us reconnecting and finding practical ways and means and theoretical ones to kind of bring that sense of culture and identity back to reality. And I like what Tracy says about that radical honesty, because part of this is about how we kind of correct narratives and try to correct colonial history that has kind of put us in a less than positive space in many areas. But I think tools like this developed with our people create the opportunities to count this is what Mātauranga talks about, counting what's strong, not just what's wrong. And that is what I love about this approach. And all of these approaches, it's not just about saying what's missing, it's also about saying, what do we have? What is here? You know, what are those kind of ancestral things that have been transformed? I think Joe Williams talks about how whanaungatanga perhaps is one of those things that has remained with us from the Hawaii to this day and age, but there'll be other things. And I think the Living Standards Framework and He Ara Waiora give us an opportunity to see well-being in its fullness. So again, just acknowledging the Treasury for the mahi, Tim, Phil, koutou. There are big challenges ahead, we know this. Some of these ideas are not simple. They are hard to kind of think about and try to theorize and come back with evidence that this is what it is. But what I love about this is that we are creating a space. This is Wellbeing Aotearoa style. We're creating a space to talk about these things in the ways that are meaningful to us. So Arthur, you talked about the child stuff. I think that's amazing. You know, there's a whole lot of things that we're doing here. Culture, we're making it particular to Aotearoa New Zealand. And for that, I congratulate the Treasury. Tēnā koutou.
I'll just build further on that. I mentioned whenua before, land. I guess the other key aspect there is water or why. So it's, and given that the emphasis on governance and institutions and wairua, I wonder whether this approach would then lead to Treasury providing advice, at least, that all control of water should lie with iwi. It's clear from the treaty that that's the case. I don't think it's hard to read the treaty in any other way than that. If Waiora is at the heart and governance and institutions are at the heart, would this lead Treasury to favour that all governance of water be in the hands of iwi?
You're being provocative there, eh, Arthur?
Well, it's interesting from an economist point of view. It doesn't matter who owns it, as long as it can be people can deal with each other on it. So, given that from a pure economics angle, it doesn't matter who owns it, and given that water is, from a spirituality point of view, a Wairoa point of view, is so central to Māori, and it's, as well as being protected in Te Tiriti, it seems pretty clear that Treasury would have to be using this framework to give pretty strong advice that the water governorship should be returned to Māori and to individual iwi.
Kia ora, Arthur. Tim and I have just been looking at each other wondering how to answer that one. I think I'll conclude by saying it's above my pay grade. And just picking up on some of the comments that are made in the chat. I mean, it's obvious that to tie out over time is going to create a much greater emphasis on some of the stuff. For the moment, as I've outlined, the Treasury is seeking to apply this through some of the key products that we can influence, and hope want to see agencies picking up on it as well. So what we're seeking is a system shift, I guess, rather than Treasury kind of picking up this one, that this is the policy direction here or there. And just also picking up on some of the comments, good to see Guy, kia ora Guy, in the comments they're asking about He Ara Waiora being adopted as the wellbeing framework, given that it's an integrated framework for Aotearoa that fully reflects our context. Well, again, this is slightly above my pay grade, but I can reflect to you what the Minister has said about these sorts of things, where he sees LSF and He Ara Waiora together. LSF, he was looking at the old version at this time, you talked about social capital and social cohesion being really important, but ideas like manaakitanga and so on, giving it the local flavour. So he sees the two of them working really closely together. Some of the bigger questions that have been put on the table, I think we have to acknowledge for the moment that they're there and will have to be tackled. And the Treasury hopes that LSF and He Ara Waiora will provide the frameworks to help us do that.
Yeah, if I could just pick up on that as well. I think that's another criticism that's sometimes made of the Living Standards Framework, and it's one argument that's made in favour of He Ara Waiora, is that the LSF isn't particularly directive. It provides a list, if you like. I would say it is a framework, and there is more detail on how the different aspects of the framework relate to each other, provided not in that surface diagram, but beneath the surface and in the more detailed papers behind it. But at the end of the day, it's unweighted. It says these are things to consider, and He Ara Waiora is a little bit more directive. So you could see that as a strength or a weakness of the LSF. Some people certainly think it's a weakness and suggest that we should, as the Treasury, just be focused on cost-benefit analysis. I guess I would suggest that we need both bits of the puzzle. We need a way to start a process and open a conversation and understand the various ways in which a problem could be understood, such as in Arthur's provocations about land and water. That's certainly one argument that you could stand up and explore using these frameworks, but it's not necessarily going to be the only way in which these issues can be understood. And other processes and other tools, including cost-benefit analysis, are needed. having opened the conversation, then to move it towards some sort of closure. But ultimately, these decisions aren't for the Treasury to make, they're for our elected representatives to make. We just offer advice and information and competing perspectives. So our role as public servants is to understand those competing perspectives and provide that information to ministers.
Just sort of picking up on that, Tim, I think it is an important element for us to consider. Certainly, I don't think anyone wants to go back to a time where Treasury would only be looking at sort of a cost and effective sort of value, because we know what gets left out in that. I think one of the things that's been done here and been done very purposefully, thoughtfully, is recognizing what the gaps are, and that if we have got a wellbeing framework more generally, then we can't go back to perhaps ways that Treasury, and not just here in Aotearoa, but in other places, have worked in the past. And I just saw another, one of the other questions or comments, which was talking about the connection with RSI, with research, science and innovation, and with the Te Ara Waiora launch that was just happened the other day. So I think that all of these elements are really important ones to engage with. We did with quite a large number of Māori scholars, we this year put out a report called Te Pūtahitanga, Tiriti-led science policy approach for Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'll put that up into the chat as well for those who might not have seen it to look at. But again, it really looks about where we can draw on deep veins of knowledge, and it sits within our communities, it sits within our whānau, it sits within those who are very new to this country, and it sits with those who have sat generations within this country. And so I think there we were particularly looking at a much more overtly tiriti centered approach, one that was very cognizant and mindful of work that's been done, most recently seen in He Puapua, but with the Mātiki Mai report, and before that in terms of the different spaces and spheres in which we can work and go forward. But it does come, but it is also about addressing the issues of social inequities around what it means to have the health and wealth in the broader sense of thinking about wealth in that broader sense, what we could do there. And I just got one little quote from it that it sort of goes back to that leadership issue. And it says, the interconnected nature of kaitiakitanga, manamotahaki and whakapapa means that Māori have both the right and obligation to protect and secure the integrity of mātauranga. And I think that also in terms of thinking about our waters and our lands, we know that for Māori and for actually more collectively, it's not around ownership, but it is around who will collectively look after the interests of Papatūānuku, who will look after those interests for those who are to come. And I think that that is a useful one. As you rightly say, Tim, it's not one for Treasury to determine. I think it is one, however, to be informed and shaped by some of the ways that Treasury might be thinking, but it's a much more collective way of responding. And again, I think it is important that Treasury is doing this work alongside all of the many other people doing this type of work.
Kia ora. I'm wondering if that's a good place to leave it. Or Arthur, I did just see you unmute. Is there something you'd like to add at this point?
Yeah, I'll just raise a question. I think these have been described as prompts for people to talk about, to consider when making policy. And I guess one of the issues as a person who's not Māori comes in when documents like this talk about tikanga. In Tim's paper, background paper, he made it quite clear that views differ not just between groups but within groups as well, and I think that's the same with tikanga. I recall when the End of Life Choice Act was going through, was being debated, various Māori leaders saying it's not tika to end of, to help somebody end their life, and other Māori leaders were saying no, it is tika to allow people to end their life. And Willie Jackson, the minister, saying there is no one tikanga. Tikanga changes across time and across place, and we know that the majority of Māori voted for the End of Life Choice Act, as opposed to many of their leaders who said that it was not tika. I wonder, when we talk about tikanga as being a central part of the framework here, whose tikanga is it, or is this a sort of a prompt for conversation both within Māori and between Māori?
I'll just say a little bit to that, Arthur. I mean, I think, tikanga, it also includes values. As we all know, there are different views of what values are important. We do this all the time in subject matter. Like any society, Te Ao Māori has people with different views, but at the heart of it, everybody would say, well, these are the important values. And I do think that they are discussions that we have in Te Ao Māori, like we have in wider Western society. And then there are tikanga that everybody goes, well, there are values that everybody goes, yes, those make sense. So I think we've just got to be careful when we, and Māoridom, my father always taught me, in Te Ao Māori, in English, I mean, it's not always true, but in general, one word can mean special things, specific things, but in Te Ao Māori, one word means many things. And I think this is part of the translation and the dialogue process I think we're going to go through as a society, in terms of us being more familiar with how we speak, how we frame things, and how we discuss things. So I think it's a good point, because lots of people say to me something like manaakitanga. Phil, you raised it before. Isn't that hospitality? Doesn't that really mean hospitality, looking after your visitors? Whereas in Te Ao Māori, these things, it's all contextual. So I think part of what you're saying, Arthur, is the context. And part of it is there will be a discussion between New Zealanders and chiefs and everybody about, what's the thing that's most important. And what's good is I think we're including ways and means to do this in a Māori way, with Māori ideas and concepts. The aim being that this will become the Aotearoa way of doing these things. So that's just my thought. Kia ora. Tracy, you might have a more a smarter way of saying that.
No, I haven't got a smarter way of saying that. That's fine. I mean, I think that the big element there is, I think there is some that really wonder about tikanga sitting within Crown agencies. And often it's better just to think about what's tika in a Crown agency. And I think that's, we've had a group, Ngā Mātauranga and MSD, very learned individuals been looking at some of these issues for us. And that was sort of in the same way that, of not thinking about it as a rangatira space, though of course people will operate in that other things, that tikanga, that may be what we're really wanting to work about, just what is right, what's fair, what's equitable under these circumstances. The tikanga, I think, will underscore that in other types of ways, but perhaps in Crown agencies, that might be a much more useful starting place, the tikanga place.
Kia ora tātou. Yeah, I endorse those comments. I think, tikanga, as I said during my presentation, is a very steeped thing, which I didn't really hope to be able to convey today, or expect your average policy analyst in the public sector to grab hold of immediately. And I think Tracy's offered quite a practical way of getting into it, at least.
What is tika?
And I think Sandra has dropped into the chat a link to Sasha McMeeking's paper, 2019, background paper on He Ara Waiora. And she offers some ideas about breaking down some of these concepts in a way that we can pick them up and start to work with them. So for anyone who's interested, I'd recommend that too.
Thank you, Phil. Well, that may be a good place to wrap up this discussion today. I'm thinking we've covered a lot of ground, obviously, and there is a lot of expectation and interest in implementation and how this is actually going to how this is going to be implemented throughout our beautiful society in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Again, I'd like to thank our supporters very much. Of course, the Treasury, Statistics New Zealand, the Productivity Commission, and also I'd like to thank ICA for all our agencies helping us coming together and bringing forward this really important discussion. And if I could, Atawhai, put you on the spot, please, to just close us out. I think it's important just to finish this discussion, and again, thank you so much, everybody, for coming today.
Okay, kia ora tātou. Yeah, anei te tei karakia. Unuhia ki te urutapu nui. Kia wātea, kua wātea, kia māma, kua māma, tūturu o whiti whakamaua kia tīna, tīna, hui e, tai ki e. Kia ora, thank you everybody.
Kia ora. Thank you so much.